Hello again, friends. I'm going to invite you once again to come in and have a seat.
We gotta go over this downstairs.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
I also want to acknowledge that we are still on YouTube, so we are live streaming the Q&A. So I'm just saying hello to our friends who are joining us remotely. Glad you're here. I'm sorry we're not able to take your questions, but glad you're here. So I'm going to hope and trust that perhaps your questions will be asked among those who are here and live with us today. I'm going to start the Q&A with a question that I've been dying to ask you, Bill, which is this. So in your book, you talk a lot about this church. You talk a lot about Hancock Church, and it's really fun to read about this place that we love and to see, especially for me, I'm the youngest senior minister here in over 70 years, and the last senior minister here to have small children was Henry Clark. So it's nice for me to sort of see through the lens of someone who grew up in that time. And I'm wondering this. We're Hancock Church. We're leaders. We attempt to be leaders in all that we do, and we have this rich history, and we're in the midst of this really liminal time for the church in general, and a very uncertain time for the world in general. And this may be a big question, but what do you see as our charge in this work?
Well, so can you hear me through this?
You need to turn the power on.
I thought I did turn it on, but it is on, but maybe I'll use this. Can you hear me through this? All right, let me and can people see me okay sitting down? I managed to do in my Achilles heel earlier in the summer, so it's a little easier for me right now to sit than stand. So, one of the parts that was really interesting, Barbara, for me in this book was trying to sort of track what happened to American Christendom over the last half century. And there's been very few parts of our society that have changed more. In the late 1960s, 52% of Americans belonged to one of the mainline Protestant denominations. So they were Congregationalist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, American Baptist, or I'm forgetting somebody here. Episcopalian, thank you. They're easy to forget. Now that 52% is about 14%. So just about literally 75% reduction in the. So and what that means is that, once upon a time, churches like Hancock were the, absolute bulwark of their communities. I say in the book, I quoted someone who's saying you couldn't get elected to the Board of Selectmen in Lexington if you hadn't come through the Hancock Church Men's Club first, in the 1960s and things. Well, obviously, that's changed, and in many ways for the better. But for other ways, it's been sad. Because I think that those churches, by and large, were engaged with the rest of America on this broad project of trying to make this a better place. The sort of work, the sort of American drive that had come out of the Depression and the Second World War and continued on through the 60s with LBJ's Great Society and Dr. King's beloved community. One of the things I was very struck with when I was retelling the story of the events on the Battle Green was that there's a long oral history interview with Robert Cataldo, then the chair of the Board of Selectmen, who made the decision to send in the police and arrest everybody. And he was 2 years or 10 years later, when he was doing this interview, he was still spitting mad at the clergy of all the churches in Lexington. And he went down one after another, just naming them, including the priests at Sacred Heart and at St. Bridget's, at his church, just calling them out for being involved, activist, helping protesters, pushing affordable housing, on and on and on. And that was quite revelatory to me, to be reminded of just how central in the 1960s or early 1970s these congregations were in setting the tone. Not successful enough, hence that, the fact that that referendum on affordable housing that every minister in town had backed failed 2-1, but nonetheless powerful. So now you're in a different position. We're all in a different position in what we used to call the mainline Protestant church, and now you might want to call the kind of sidelined Protestant church at some level. We're at a small percentage of the population, and in many cases, congregations are older. It was very good to see some young people here. What that means is that these congregations are not going to be the culture, but that frees them to be the counterculture in a sense, which probably is a lot closer to what the early church was like and what the kind of message was designed for. When we constituted most of the population of the country and most of the power structure of the country, there was no way to avoid baptizing and sanctifying the status quo in lots of ways. And now that's not necessary. People are freed to be, I think, in congregations a little more daring. And I've been so pleased, among other things, to see Hancock joining in this work of the GBIO, because that is radical in its way and bold and pushing, and those are important things. So I tend not to grieve too much for the fact that this is no longer how the culture is defined. That's just how it is, for better or for worse. But the point is to find what the possibilities now are for new, strong ways of being.
I know that you all have lots of questions, so I'll do the best I can to get to you. Who would like to ask a question? Bob.
Bill, I so much enjoyed the part of your book where you talked about the impact that Dan Smith had on our congregation in our town. In fact, you probably don't know this, but he created a housing partnership to try to promote affordable housing. And I was in that as one of the members of Hancock Church. And he turned to me one day and said, you really ought to lead this group. For 10 years then, I was involved in the partnership trying to get affordable housing in Lexington. And it was an uphill battle. But we actually did some good. But I think in the state, they just passed a new law, as you probably know, that promotes affordable housing. Of course, it's getting a lot of feedback from the towns impacted, but I think the young people involved in supporting that and getting it through the Congress in state are exceptional people. And if you listen to what they have to say, there's a lot of good stuff. And I'm hoping that their message will get through somehow. But it is an uphill battle.
Amen, Bob. And it's very interesting. The questions of affordable housing turn out to be not just questions of justice, but very much questions around environmental progress, too. The fact that in much of the country it's very difficult to build dense housing of any kind is obviously, if you sit back and think about it for a few minutes, a mistake. I mean, we need dense housing along transit corridors so that the landform exemplified by Lexington, sprawling suburb, everybody with their own driveway and their own house and their own yard, just turns out to be, if you were trying to design a world that would warm up quickly, this is what how you would design it, And so these questions are, and they also, and this is one of the things that's been very interesting as we've been doing this work at Third Act now with older people, they have a lot of, affordable housing and dense housing have a lot of implications for people my age. The AARP in parts of the country has become aggressive defenders now of changing zoning codes to allow for more dense housing, because if older people are going to age in place, it's going to be much easier if they're in communities where you can walk to the things that you need, where you actually have neighbors, on and on and on. Places like Hancock have done a great job of preserving neighborly ties, but it's hard work. It sort of goes against all the physical layout of a place like Lexington, and in general it hasn't worked very well. The average American has half as many close friends as the average American of the 1950s, and it's mostly because we devoted most of our treasure since the 1950s to the project of building bigger houses farther apart from each other. And that just inevitably leads to a kind of decline in the ability of people to connect and interact. So these questions around housing have all kinds of layers to them, which shouldn't be entirely surprising for those of us in a faith tradition that came out of the notion that holding things in common, living together, eating together, was at the heart of what we did.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate the theological perspective that you're bringing here, so thank you.
If I make any mistakes, you let me know.
No,
so
you're doing great. We started as a marginalized group. We're somewhat back to being a marginalized group, and that's not all bad. And this need of holding, a lot more in common that we do is clearly evident. A reminder of Wednesday night's meeting on Zoom about affordable housing. Very apropos. Yes, thank you, Ruth. So Ruth is part of the leadership team that is putting this together. You do have to register for this event, and all of that information is everywhere. It is in the bulletin, the weekly, our website, etc. And if you need it, let us know. Okay. Ruth, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, just really quickly. It's not just for Lexingtonians. There are a number of people that have already registered from about 13 other towns that happen to be part of faith communities, but like Hancock, we have people that come from other towns, and so we encourage others to do it, because it's a talk of affordable housing is an issue not just for Lexington, it's for a lot of towns around. So I encourage you to sign up.
Thank you, Ruth. Questions?
Thank you. Bill, can you tell us more about Third Act and the bank campaign?
Sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about Third Act just to begin with, and then about this campaign. We started it about 8 or 10 months ago, and it's been growing like topsy, and no small part thanks, as I said earlier, to my colleague Veronique, who's here with us today. But people have not tried to organize older Americans in a long time for progressive causes. The last real attempt was a wonderful woman named Maggie Kuhn in the 1970s, who set up a group called the Gray Panthers that did good work for a decade. The reason that people haven't is because there's a conviction that people become more conservative as they age. And there's some small amount of statistical backup for that. But in fact, I think that that's wrong, at least with the current group of people who are this age. Because if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, or your 90s, Mom, your first act was, at a period, you were around for this period of epic social, cultural, political transformation that really changed the world in many ways. If you don't believe me, look at the long list of recent Supreme Court decisions, all of them aimed at things that happened between the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, and Roe v. Wade of 1973. So our slogan's sort of becoming, we won these fights once, we can do it again. And so it doesn't surprise me that people have responded as well as they have, because I think that's the real rooted DNA of these generations, perhaps. But the bank, this work we're doing around banks and climate change, it really draws on one of the other things that's important about older Americans, which is that we ended up with all the money. 70% of the country's financial assets belong to boomers or the silent generation, compared with about 5% for millennials. So we want to take on these banks, and this demographic is one of the groups that really should be able to do it to one degree or another. So look, obviously not an easy challenge. These are the 4 biggest banks in the world. They're also the 4 biggest fossil fuel lenders. They're kind of the capital in capitalism, more or less. And so not easy to move, but not impossible either. We have some experience doing this work. Over the last 10 years, we've run this huge divestment campaign to get institutions to sell their stock in the fossil fuel industry. That's now at about $40 trillion in endowments, pension funds, so on. The UCC was an early adopter. Most of the denominations have joined in. The Pope has become one of our biggest supporters. We lost another one last week when Queen Elizabeth, who had divested from her large holdings in things from fossil fuel. We're very confident that King Chuck is going to continue in the same vein because he's been a good environmentalist for a long time. But we think that this same logic will work in pushing the banks to do the right thing. The numbers are really quite astonishing. Because money that you put in a bank gets lent out to build pipelines or LNG terminals or something, if you have $125,000 in the American banking system, it's probably producing more carbon every year than all the heating, cooking, flying, cooling, and driving that you're doing if you're an average American. That's pretty staggering figure, especially since there's plenty of people who have more than 125 grand in the bank someplace. So the first step, because it's the easiest and the way to be sort of most in public and whatever, is we're going after the credit cards associated with these guys. You almost certainly have at least one, even if you don't know it, because your United card, your Amazon credit card, your Costco credit card are all linked to one of these banks. So come next spring, we're going to be cutting them up. We're going to have a day when we do it, because don't try any of this by yourself. Unless you're very, very, very rich, it's possible Chase will not notice that you cut up your credit card if you just do it. But if we do it at the same time, we'll be able to start making, and we'll make a spectacle of ourselves a little bit. There'll be people outside banks. There'll be people underwater on dying coral reefs. There'll be people up against the fire-scarred forests of California, so on and so forth. And hopefully it'll be one good way to sort of push the financial. One way to think about it is, if we're going to get quick action on climate change, there are really only 2 levers big enough to pull that really matter. One of them is marked politics, government. We've pulled that pretty hard, and we finally got something from it at a national level this summer when the Inflation Reduction Act was signed. The other lever that matters is finance, money, and we have to pull that one to the ground now and see what we can do. Because we're behind in this race, and we need very much to be evening out the race as best we can.
Thank you, Bill. I'm trusting that we'll be aware of what's happening and when those actions are happening. This spring, you said?
Yes, I'll tell you when the actions are happening, and Veronique was the one who thought this up. they're going to happen on March 21st, 2023. Why? Because it's just too good to pass up the fact that that's 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. So there you are. You should not forget it at this point.
I was interested, Bill, in your comments about climate justice and the importance of sort of a social justice strategy to thinking about climate change. And then as we began the discussion today, it was about housing justice. And there are so many aspects of justice in our society now that need to be fought. Does it worry you that somehow that's going to dilute the climate change efforts, or is that a multiplier?
I think it's a multiplier. I hope it is. I think it has to be, because we obviously can't separate out these fights anymore in useful ways. From the beginning, Third Act is focused on two things. One is protecting the climate and the other protecting democracy, which means in this case, in this country, above all, protecting the right to vote of black people in America, stopping the efforts at voting suppression, allowing people to play a full role in figuring out what we're going to do in this society. And these are also the two things that I think that we took for granted mistakenly at a certain point. I mean, you know, it was easy to take them for granted. 1970, we think about 20 million Americans went out in the streets for Earth Day. That would have been about 10% of the then population, maybe the biggest demonstration in American history, and it worked. Within a year, we had the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. So if you were around in 1970, you can be forgiven for thinking we'd done a lot of what we needed to do and that the systems were... Similarly, you know, our democracy seemed to be working. It was in those years that we went through Watergate, which was traumatic, but, I mean, it all came out correctly. You know, the guy left on an airplane and, you know, that was that. It would be hard to imagine that faced with climate change and a threat an order of magnitude larger than the air pollution or water pollution that we'd been dealing with in the 1970s, that it would take Congress literally 34 years between the moment when Jim Hansen testified in 1988 and the summer of 2022 when they finally passed their first piece of serious climate legislation. Similarly, it's still mind-boggling to me. I don't quite believe it that thousands and thousands of our fellow citizens stormed the nation's capital and were killing police officers in order to stop the counting of votes. That would have seemed just incomprehensible if you told somebody in this congregation that that was going to happen, 50 years ago. So not taking those things for granted is an important start. And if we don't take them for granted, if we build a more robust and working democracy, then we have some hope of getting at these justice issues. The good news is, and it really is good news, that there is a large majority of Americans who want to do the right thing on issue after issue after issue. The bad news is that our political system is so dysfunctional that that desire to do the right thing doesn't translate into anything good happening. I mean, you saw we finally got this climate bill by the absolute narrowest of possible margins, and because of that, the fossil fuel industry was able to put all sorts of bad stuff in it too, So we need a much more reflective democracy than we have, which is, more or less the fight that the Minutemen were taking on a long time ago. So, history advances, we hope. It's been in retrograde for a little while. Our job is to get it moving in the right direction again.
Bill, first of all, my name is Ingrid Klimoff. Secondly, can you talk about consumption? Mm-hmm. And can you talk about maybe why it is that most people here don't realize that Greta, the Swedish woman, young woman, just eats plants, and the importance of eating a plant food diet?
First of all, I'm I hope that absolutely everybody knows about Greta Thunberg, who really is one of the great souls in the whole world, one of my favorite people to work with on the planet. And if you were making an argument for the continued presence of the Holy Spirit, you could do worse than, a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl managing to capture the attention of the entire earth in the course of a few months by simply refusing to go to school and sitting. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. And yes, food is one of the places that we can think that we can have some effect here. We think about 16% of all the emissions in the world are associated with agriculture. Most of them come from the burning of fossil fuel, but agriculture is probably the second major source. And within that, it is animal agriculture, especially cows, that cause the vast majority of that, not only because of their own emissions, but more because we continue to cut down rainforest in order to provide pasture and grow feed for cattle. And so it's a very good idea to eat somewhat lower on the food chain than we do. And if that's hard for people. I just wrote the foreword to a book by a wonderful guy who wrote a book. He's started this campaign that's gaining some strength called Reducitarianism, which operates on the premise that it's pretty hard to get people to become vegans, but it's not that hard to get people to cut their consumption of meat in half in the course of a week, which just really all that would mean for most of us is eating meat the way that most cuisines around the world do it, as a, sort of something that adds taste, not as like a big slab of something, all the time. So there are plenty of ways to take that message seriously. That said, I would add, and I'm pretty sure, in fact I know because we've talked about it, that Greta would concur with me, that it really is also important not to get hung up on individual action above all else. At this point, we're not capable of solving climate change one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. It requires changes in the basic political and economic ground rules that we live under, which means that the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to shake things up a little bit, which is why we set them up. And there are lots of them. There's, 350.org for people under 30. There's the Sunrise Movement, which brought us the Green New Deal, and hence this Inflation Reduction Act as its kind of residue. There's Third Act. There's lots and lots of places for people to aggregate their power, hopefully in numbers large enough that it really can start shifting things. So very good question, and thank you.
Questions? We're all thinking. Yes, Mark, you're leaning forward. I'm taking that as you have a question.
When I was in high school, I read a book by a guy named Buckminster Fuller who talked about the trim tab effect. And I'm interested in how you think about small groups of people being able to influence larger groups of people.
Yes, how do small groups of people able to influence large groups? And that's really what movement building and organizing is about. I think when we look back on the 20th century, assuming we're able to look back on it at some point, historians will identify two great inventions. One, the solar panel, which really is an astonishing miracle, and the other is nonviolent social movements. This sort of new technology developed from the margins by the suffragists, by Gandhi, by Dr. King, by millions of people whose names we don't know, that really provided a tool in certain ways for the first time for the powerless to stand up to the powerful, for the small and many to stand up to the mighty and few. Before that, we had occasional examples of things like the Minutemen pulling something off, but the historians now tell us, and there's a wonderful woman named Erica Chenoweth at Harvard, who's really the great researcher on this, that nonviolent action is far more likely to be effective than violent response to injustice, and that it doesn't require, to go to your question, extraordinary numbers of people in order to make it happen. The math seems to be, according to Chenoweth, that in situations where you can get roughly 3.5% of a population engaged in a fight seriously, that they'll generally win that fight. And the reason for that, if you think about it, is that apathy is pervasive and it cuts both ways, you know? So I remember organizing a big march on New York, the first really big climate march in 2014, and we ended up with about 400,000 people in the streets of New York. So, you know, there's a lot of things to worry about, like are there enough toilets and so on. But the one thing we didn't worry about was, would the next day 400,000 people appear to demand more fossil fuels? Or, I mean, we knew that that was not the worry. Our job was to just activate enough of the people who really care about this into action. And it's one of the reasons why it's important not to kind of succumb to a kind of absolute despair. I wrote last week that despair, if it leads to inaction, is not a moral option at this point. Desperation, by contrast, is a kind of correct intellectual response to where we are, as long as that desperation leads one into what desperation usually does, a kind of urgency in the way that we work. So let us hope that Buckminster Fuller and Margaret Mead and everybody else were right when they observed that small groups of people can influence things in big ways. I think they can. I think the mechanism above all is what you would call the zeitgeist, the ability to shift people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. So over the last 15 years, as we've campaigned around pipelines and divesting universities and on and on and on, each of those battles has been important in and of itself, just like this battle with the credit cards and the banks and things, but they've also had this larger secondary effect all the time of shifting over time that balance of not exactly of power, but balance of intellectual and moral and social understanding that eventually leads to a shift in the balance of power. That's why, when it came right down to it this summer, Joe Manchin understood at some level that the only thing people would ever remember about him for the rest of time was that he had blocked action on the worst problem the planet had ever faced. And at a certain point, he blinked, you know. It took extraordinary organizing to make that happen. He got more than his pound of flesh in the bill and on and on and on, but that's why he blinked, because the zeitgeist had shifted, and everybody in this room who's worked on this stuff has helped shift that zeitgeist over that time.
Friends, we have time for one more question. Arthur.
Bill, you probably appreciate this. The story you tell in about the Common and the protests there. My really good friend David Goldberg was there when you and I were part of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And Kerry, there's a film, I don't know if you've seen the film, where Kerry's addressing the crowd and saying, what are we going to do? The town won't give us permission. We can't stay. We're going to all be arrested, they're telling us. But what do you want to do? And my friend David Goldberg pipes up on the tape and says, you know, the British regulars didn't ask for permission to use the Common. And of course, they all ended up getting arrested and all that. But do we need to stop waiting for permission and start taking action more aggressively?
Well, I mean, it's a good question to ask, and I don't know whether I'm the right person or wrong person to ask it of, because I'm impatient, you know. I mean, perhaps because my father, who was arrested on the Green, who was quite mild-mannered, and those of you who knew him know that this was not his, way in the world, but, and mine neither really, but now I've been to jail 10 or 12 times, in my lifetime, sometimes you do have to press. I mean, what's a way of saying it? The planet is now, and our society are now miles outside their comfort zone. That's what it means when the Arctic melts, you know. That's what it means when you know, the life expectancy of Americans has begun to plummet, you know. We're outside our comfort zone, so we need to, those of us trying to change it need to be outside our comfort zones too. Because almost by definition, the things we've been doing so far haven't been sufficient. You can prove it because the temperature keeps going up. I mean, there's a little monitor on the side of Mauna Loa in Hawaii that measures the CO2 in the atmosphere, and it just keeps ticking up. Well, that's viewed in one sense, that scientific instrument is a kind of counter of our moral progress, our ability to do the things that we have to do for each other, you know. And so I'm not saying everybody needs to go get arrested. Although, as I said yesterday at Carlton Willard, I'm always impressed by the number of people who tell me that it's on their bucket list. You know, and if you need help, I can probably provide it. But but we do need to be pushing hard and effectively. We need to be, you know, it doesn't help to be shrill and strident and things if you haven't figured out a way, some other people with whom to make it work in some way that's effective and powerful. But yeah, when the moment comes, yes, we do need to be willing to well, I mean, this should be the, I mean, I said before that nonviolent social movements were the great invention of the 20th century, and they were, but of course the iconography on which they drew was the iconography of the cross above all, you know, the kind of ultimate declaration of powerless standing up to the powerful and nonetheless having it work, you know, and so I think, I mean, and Gandhi was quite clear on that when he started writing about it, and Tolstoy and Thoreau before them, and Dr. King after them. So yeah, this is, for us in particular, this is some of the work to which we're called. So, I don't know. What a pleasure to get to be with everybody, and Barbara, many thanks for sharing your pulpit today. It was a real pleasure.
Friends, I can't pass up the opportunity to end on one little theological note. Thank you, Bill, for that setup. You didn't plan it, but it's kind of perfect. Jesus didn't obey all the rules. So the one that we say that we follow did not play by all the rules, and that part of the powers and principalities that you referred to in your sermon is that comes with the structure of the powers and principalities, this sort of passed down thought that you can only change things by playing by all the rules, which they control. So, and on that note, I thank you all for coming today and for staying for this Q&A, and hope to see you again soon. Be well.